What would you do if the one thing you were left in the world was the one thing the world considered worthless? If your inheritance was not a sum of money or a piece of fine jewelry, but a pile of crumbling stone and damp timber on a forgotten patch of moorland? For 19-year-old Lucy Ashford, this was not a question, but a reality. She inherited a cottage her own family had dismissed for a generation, a place spoken of in whispers of failure and regret. But the truth, waiting inside those crumbling walls, was a secret buried for a century, a story of loss and loyalty that would rewrite not only her future, but the entire history of a village that thought it knew everything. Settle in, and let us travel back to the damp, wind-swept heart of 1860s England, where a young woman with nothing to her name was about to unearth a legacy no one knew existed. The journey to Hartwick was a lesson in grey. The sky was a slate tablet, threatening rain that never quite fell. The road was a ribbon of mud between skeletal hedgerows. Lucy Ashford sat beside the carter, her hands tucked into the thin wool of her cloak, her face pale with a fatigue that went deeper than the 2-day journey. She had buried her grandmother a week prior, the last of her kin, and the silence that followed was a heavier burden than the small, battered trunk at her feet. Her grandmother, a woman whose hands were never still, and whose voice was a low hum of old hymns, had left her everything she possessed: a terrier named Pip, currently asleep on Lucy's lap, and a cottage in this remote village, where the family had not set foot in 50 years. Her distant cousins in the city had laughed. A ruin, one had said, not unkindly. Sell the land rights to the quarry, Lucy. It's the only sensible thing. But Lucy had made a promise to the still figure in the bed, a whispered commitment to at least see the place, to touch the stones her ancestors had touched. So she had used the last of her meager savings to hire the cart and make the journey north, into the heart of a landscape that felt as weary and worn as she did. The village, when they finally crested the last hill, was a small huddle of stone houses clustered around a squat church tower, smoke rising from the chimneys in thin, gray plumes that were quickly shredded by the wind. As the cart rumbled onto the cobbled market square, heads turned, windows framed curious faces. In a place like Hartwick, a stranger was an event, and a young woman arriving alone with a single trunk was a story already writing itself in the minds of the onlookers. Lucy kept her eyes forward, her chin lifted just enough to signal resolve rather than defiance. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure that told her she was an outsider, a disruption to the slow, ancient rhythm of the place. She had come seeking a connection to her past, but all she felt was the profound, aching loneliness of the present. The cart stopped. The journey was over. Another, more difficult one, was about to begin. The solicitor's office was a small, dusty room above the baker's shop, smelling of old paper and sealing wax. The solicitor himself, Mr. Blackwood, was away on business. His clerk, a young man with an ink-stained collar and an air of immense self-importance, handled the matter. He barely looked at Lucy as he retrieved a slim folder. "Ashford Cottage," he announced, as if naming a particularly stubborn stain on the carpet. "The deed is here. Transfer is straightforward. Your grandmother saw to the fees before her passing." He pushed the vellum document across the desk. It was brittle and yellowed. The ink faded to a faint brown. Lucy traced the name with her finger. It felt impossibly fragile, like a dried leaf. "There is also this," the clerk added, retrieving a small wooden box from a drawer. "Her personal effects, sent on from the parish where she lived." He placed it beside the deed, with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Lucy took the items, murmuring her thanks. The clerk gave a thin, dismissive smile. "Should you decide to sell the plot, Mr. Thorne has expressed a standing interest. He owns the quarry to the west. It would save you a great deal of trouble." The implication was clear. The cottage was a burden, a problem to be disposed of as quickly as possible. Lucy said nothing, merely inclining her head before turning to leave. She found a modest room to let at the village inn, the Shepherd's Rest. It was clean but cold, with a single window overlooking the churchyard. That evening, by the flickering light of a tallow candle, she sat on the edge of the lumpy bed and finally opened the wooden box. Inside, there was not much. A silver thimble, worn smooth with use. A small, pressed flower, its petals the color of faded parchment. A miniature portrait of a man she did not recognize. And at the very bottom, a single letter, sealed with a drop of plain wax. Her grandmother's hand, though shakier than she remembered, was still elegant. The letter was short, filled with the familiar, loving phrases and quiet reassurances that had been the bedrock of Lucy's childhood. It spoke of pride and of sorrow for leaving so little behind. But the final lines made Lucy's breath catch in her throat. "Do not be dismayed by what you find, my dear child," it read. "The cottage is only the key. Remember the heart of Stonefall. That is your true inheritance." Lucy read the words again and again. Stonefall. The name meant nothing to her. She had never heard it spoken. There was no Stonefall in their family history. It must be a fancy, a poetic turn of phrase from a woman in her final days. A metaphor for resilience, perhaps. She folded the letter. A strange sense of disappointment mingling with her grief. It was just a ruin, after all. What was Stonefall? A forgotten name from a childhood story? A flight of fancy born of fever and old age? Or was it the key to a secret, buried for generations? A truth, hidden in plain sight? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden histories and unexpected legacies. For Lucy, holding that cryptic letter in the cold light of a rented room, it was a puzzle she could not yet afford to solve. A whisper of a promise in a world that had offered her nothing but cold, hard reality. The next morning, Lucy walked through the village, the letter folded safely in her pocket. The whispers followed her, quiet but persistent. She was the Ashford girl, the one who'd come to claim the ruin. As she passed the public house, a loud, booming voice cut through the morning air. "Well, well!" The heiress herself. Mr. Thorne, the squire, stood on the steps, a tankard in his hand, flanked by two men who mirrored his smirk. He was a large man, his face ruddy with drink and authority. "Come to take possession of your estate, Miss Ashford? A fine pile of stones and damp rot it is. I offered your grandmother a fair price for it 10 years ago. For the quarry rights, you understand." She was a stubborn old woman. He took a deep swallow from his tankard, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'll make you the same offer. £5 for the deed. It's more than the timber is worth." Lucy stopped. She felt the eyes of the village on her, waiting for her response. She looked directly at Mr. Thorne, her expression calm, her gaze steady. She said nothing at all. Her silence was a strange kind of shield, a quiet refusal to engage that seemed to unnerve him more than any sharp retort. After a long moment, she simply inclined her head and continued on her way, leaving him sputtering in her wake. Her destination was the churchyard. She found her grandmother's family plot in a quiet corner, beneath the shade of an ancient yew tree. The name Ashford was carved into several weathered headstones, green with moss. While she stood there, tracing the letters of a great-great-aunt's name, an old man approached, carrying a pair of shears. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of one who has spent a lifetime in quiet places. "You'll be Eleanor's girl," he said, not as a question. His voice was like the rustle of dry leaves. "I am Mr. Abernathy. I was the parish clerk here for 40 years. He began to snip away the ivy that was encroaching on a nearby grave, his focus entirely on his task. "Your grandmother was a good woman," he murmured, his back still to her. "She remembered things the rest of us took care to forget." He paused his work, his hand resting on the cold stone of the grave. He turned his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy line of the moors. "Don't judge a tree by its broken branches," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Some roots find water in the deepest dark." And with that, he straightened up, touched the brim of his hat, and shuffled away down the path, leaving Lucy alone with the silent stones and his cryptic words. They settled in her mind next to her grandmother's, another piece of a puzzle she didn't know how to assemble. That afternoon, she found Tom Fletcher, the young carter who had brought her to Hartwick. He was a plain-spoken man with kind eyes, whose own grandmother had been a friend of hers. For the price of a hot meal and a few shillings, he agreed to haul her trunk and a small cart of provisions up the lane to the cottage. The lane itself was more of a scar on the hillside than a proper road, deeply rutted and overgrown with brambles that scraped against the sides of the cart. It climbed steadily, leaving the village behind until it was just a smudge of gray stone in the valley below. After nearly a mile, the lane ended abruptly in a small, neglected clearing. And there it was. Ashford Cottage was not so much a house as a suggestion of one. The roof, made of heavy stone slates, sagged alarmingly in the middle, like a tired old spine. Most of the windows were boarded over, and the one that wasn't was a dark, gaping hole. The stone walls were slick with a vibrant green moss, and the whole structure seemed to be slowly surrendering to the ivy and wild rose that clung to it. Pip, who had been trotting alongside the cart, let out a low, mournful whine. Tom Fletcher whistled softly through his teeth. "Begging your pardon, Miss Ashford, but it's in a sorry state." Lucy slid down from the cart, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. She walked to the front of the cottage, to the heavy oak door that hung crookedly on one hinge. "It's mine," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Together, they used a crowbar from the cart to pry the swollen door open. It groaned in protest, scraping against the stone floor, and a wave of cold, musty air rushed out to meet them, a smell of damp earth, decay, and years of stillness. The interior was a single, cavernous room. A great stone hearth dominated one wall, black with the soot of 1,000 forgotten fires. A crude ladder led to a small sleeping loft above. The space was utterly bare, stripped of all furniture, all life. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light that pierced the gloom from the broken window. Tom looked at her with open concern. "You can't stay here, miss. Not like this. There are folks in the village who take you in for a fair price." But Lucy shook her head. She had to do this. For her grandmother, for herself. He left her with a lantern, a tinderbox, and the provisions she'd purchased, promising to return in a week's time to check on her. As dusk began to settle, painting the moors in shades of violet and indigo, Lucy sat on the floor of her new home, her cloak wrapped tightly around her. Pip curled up against her, his small, warm body a comfort in the vast, cold emptiness. She did not light a fire. She simply sat and listened to the sounds of the old house, the creak of timber, the skittering of unseen things, and the low moan of the wind as it slipped through the cracks in the walls. It did not sound menacing. It sounded like a long, drawn-out sigh. The first days were a battle against neglect. Lucy worked from dawn until the light failed, her body aching with a weariness she had never known. She swept away layers of dirt, leaves, and brittle mouse skeletons. She cleared the fallen stones from the doorway and used them to build a rough step. Her hands, once soft, became chapped and calloused. She focused her energy on the great stone hearth, knowing that a fire was the first step toward turning the ruin into a shelter. It was choked with a solid mass of old soot, birds' nests, and fallen debris from the chimney. She worked for 2 days with a stick and her bare hands, pulling out the foul-smelling mess. As she finally cleared the opening, she began to scrub the massive stone lintel that spanned the top of the fireplace. She expected it to be plain, functional, a simple piece of rock hewn from the local quarry. But as she scraped away the thickest layer of grime, her fingers felt an indentation. It wasn't a crack or a natural flaw in the stone. It was a deliberate shape. Curious, she took a rag and a bucket of precious water and began to clean it with determined effort. Slowly, an image emerged from beneath the black crust. It was a carving, finely and skillfully rendered, a bird of prey, a falcon or a hawk, its wings spread wide in flight, its head turned sharply to the side. It was a beautiful, powerful image, utterly out of place in such a humble, rustic dwelling. It was the sort of carving one might find in a church or on the gatepost of a great estate. Lucy sat back on her heels, staring at it in the dim light. The bird's carved eye seemed to be looking directly at a specific section of the back wall of the hearth, the wall that was built directly into the rising slope of the hillside. She ran her hands over that wall, It was made of the same rough, uneven fieldstone as the rest of the cottage, except for one small, rectangular patch near the floor. There, for a space of about 3 feet square, the wall was made of dark red brick. The mortar was a lighter gray, and felt grittier, newer than the crumbling mixture holding the rest of the stones together. It looked for all the world like an old bread oven that had been crudely and permanently sealed. Why? Why go to the trouble of bricking it up so solidly? Why would the falcon be gazing at it? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. For now, there was too much else to do. She had a roof to mend and a garden to clear. But even as she worked, the image of the falcon's fierce, unblinking stare remained fixed in her mind. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the slow turning of the season. The vibrant green of late summer faded to the golds and russets of autumn. Lucy found a rhythm in her labor. She learned the language of the cottage, the particular groan of the main beam when the wind blew from the north, the way the sunlight fell through the broken window at midday, the spots where the damp was worst. She patched the roof with slates she found half buried in the overgrown garden, a painstaking and perilous task that left her muscles screaming. She reglazed the broken window using a small pane of glass Tom Fletcher brought her on one of his weekly visits. He never commented on her slow progress, never offered pity, only practical help and news from the village, which mostly consisted of Mr. Thorne's continued grumbling. Pip became her shadow, her silent companion in the long, quiet days. He would lie for hours on the hearthstone, watching her work, his presence a steady, unassuming comfort. But every evening, as the light faded and Lucy built a small fire, the dog would repeat his strange ritual. He would not settle by the warmth. Instead, he would pad over to the bricked-up section of the back wall, lie down before it, and let out a single, low growl that vibrated deep in his chest. He would stare at the bricks, as if expecting them to move. An animal's senses, her grandmother used to say, were more honest than a man's. Pip's unease fed her own. The patch of brickwork was a discordant note in the simple melody of the house. It felt wrong. It felt cold. One evening, a profound exhaustion settled over her. She sat by the fire, watching the flames, feeling the immense weight of her solitude. Pip was at his post, a small, furry sentinel, guarding a secret he could not name. His quiet insistence was the final push she needed. The next morning, she rose with a new sense of purpose. She took the old iron poker she'd found amongst the rubble in the hearth, its end bent into a hook. She found a heavy, flat-sided stone to use as a mallet. Standing before the brick patch, she felt a tremor of anticipation, a feeling that she was standing on the threshold of something significant. She took a deep breath of the cold morning air and swung the stone, striking the end of the poker where she had wedged it into a crack in the mortar. The sound was dull, unsatisfying, but a puff of gray dust bloomed from the joint. The mortar was soft, just as she'd suspected. It wasn't the hard, lime-based mortar of the original stonework. This was a weaker, sandier mix, the work of an amateur, or someone in a great hurry. Methodically, patiently, she chipped away, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap echoing in the small cottage. An hour passed, then another. Finally, with a grating scrape, the first brick came loose in her hands. She pulled it out and peered into the darkness behind it. There was nothing but black emptiness, and the faint, cold smell of a place that had not seen air or light for a very long time. Lucy worked with renewed urgency, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled out a second brick, then a third, the opening growing wider. The darkness within was absolute, a solid, tangible black that seemed to swallow the light from the cottage. Holding her lantern high, she leaned forward and pushed it through the hole. The flame flickered wildly for a moment, then steadied, casting a pool of trembling golden light onto a narrow, stone-lined passage. It was not an oven. It was a tunnel, sloping gently downwards into the earth. Taking a steadying breath, Lucy set the lantern on the floor, squeezed her shoulders through the rough opening, and dropped down into the passage on the other side. The air was shockingly cold and still, carrying the scent of deep earth and stone. Pip, after a moment of whining hesitation, scrambled through the hole after her, his claws scrabbling on the flagstones. He pressed close to her legs, a warm, trembling presence in the oppressive dark. She picked up the lantern and moved forward. The passage was no more than 20 feet long, ending at a low, arched doorway that opened into a small, vaulted chamber. It was a cellar, but unlike any she had ever seen. The stonework was precise, the vaulted ceiling a testament to masterful skill, and in the very center of the floor stood a large chest, made of dark oak, bound with heavy straps of rusted iron. It was not locked, but the damp had swollen the wood so tightly it was effectively sealed. Lucy set the lantern down and placed her hands on the lid. She pulled with all her might, her muscles straining. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan of protesting wood, the lid tore free. Inside, swaddled in a thick layer of waxed oilcloth, was a tin box. It was heavy. Her fingers trembled as she worked the clasp. She lifted the lid, and she saw them. Documents. Stacks of them. All perfectly preserved from the damp. Ledgers bound in decaying leather. Birth and marriage certificates, tied with faded ribbon. And at the very bottom, a thick sheet of vellum, folded 4 times. She carefully unfolded it. The script was archaic, the ink a deep, rich black. It was a deed of title, dated 1758, for an estate known as Stonefall Manor, which included a house of 30 rooms, stables, walled gardens, a home farm, and 300 acres of surrounding moorland. The name of the owner, repeated throughout the document, was Ashford. Beneath the deed lay one final letter, written in her grandmother's shaky hand. This was not a short note, but pages and pages, a confession and a history. It told a story of tragedy. A century ago, a virulent fever had swept through Stonefall Manor, taking the patriarch and his 3 young sons in the space of a single winter. The sole survivor, his grief-stricken younger brother, believed the house itself was cursed. In a fit of sorrow and fear, he had sealed the main house, bricking up the doors and windows. He built the small cottage at the gates to live out his days as a watchman over his family's tomb. Over the generations, as the family's fortunes dwindled, the story was forgotten. The great house, hidden from the lane by a thick stand of trees, became a ghost, then a rumor, then nothing. The knowledge of it passed down through a single line, a secret kept by the women of the family, until it reached her grandmother. "I am too old and frail to claim what is ours," the letter concluded. "But you have the strength I have lost. Restore our name, Lucy. Bring the light back to Stonefall." Lucy sat on the cold floor of the hidden cellar, the lantern light flickering across the pages of her family's history. The weight of it settled upon her, not as a burden, but as a mantle of profound responsibility. She was not the inheritor of a ruin. She was the custodian of a forgotten world. She carefully placed the documents back in the tin box and carried her discovery back through the passage into the cottage. As she emerged, she felt a change in the air. The light filtering through the window had grown dim and gray, and the wind had risen to a low, keening howl. A great autumn storm, which had been threatening for days, was rolling in from the moors. Within the hour, the heavens opened. Rain fell in solid, driving sheets, drumming against the patched roof and turning the ground outside into a quagmire. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cottage, testing the old stones. Soon, a telltale drip began to fall near the hearth. Then another. The roof, which she had so painstakingly mended, was no match for the fury of the storm. Water began to pool on the floor, creeping dangerously close to the corner where she had placed the precious tin box. She moved it to the driest spot she could find, on the small wooden shelf she had built, and covered it with her own cloak, the only truly waterproof thing she owned. Just as the storm reached its zenith, a frantic, desperate knocking rattled the cottage door. Lucy froze. No one would be out in this weather. She cautiously opened the door a crack. A man stood there, drenched to the skin, his face etched with panic. "Please," he shouted over the gale. "My wagon! It's lost a wheel in the lane. My wife and child are still in it." Without a second's hesitation, Lucy threw the door open. "Bring them inside, quickly." The man, whose name was Miller, ran back into the storm and returned moments later, his wife, leaning on his arm, and a small, sleeping child wrapped in a blanket in his arms. Lucy led them into the small circle of warmth and light cast by her fire. She had little to offer, but she gave them what she had: her last half-loaf of bread, a small wedge of cheese, and the driest spot on the floor. While the Miller family slept, exhausted and safe, Lucy spent the night awake, huddled with Pip, guarding the tin box. Sometime after midnight, a loud crack echoed through the cottage. A section of the roof near the door had given way, and rain and wind poured in. Mr. Miller was instantly awake, and together, by the dim light of the lantern, they worked to brace the sagging timbers with the old ladder and a length of rope from his wagon. In that moment of shared crisis, working with a stranger to protect his family in her meager home, Lucy's resolve solidified into something unbreakable. This legacy wasn't about land or a grand house. It was about shelter. It was about providing refuge. She had made her choice. She would not abandon this place. She would restore it. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving a world washed clean and shining under a pale, watery sun. The lane was a churning river of mud, but the little cottage, though battered, had held. Mr. Miller, his face filled with a gratitude too deep for words, spent the morning helping Lucy effect a more permanent repair on the damaged roof before he and his family departed, promising to send word of her kindness to all he met. A few days later, when the ground had dried enough to be passable, Lucy wrapped the tin box in oilcloth, placed it in a sack, and began the long walk to the market town of Oakhaven. She went directly to the offices of Mr. Davies, the senior solicitor, whose clerk had been so dismissive. Mr. Davies was the opposite of his subordinate, a quiet, elderly man with kind, intelligent eyes behind spectacles. He listened to Lucy's entire story without interruption, his hands steepled before him, his expression revealing nothing. When she finished, she pushed the tin box across his polished desk. He opened it and began to examine the contents, one document at a time. He read her grandmother's letter, his brow furrowed in concentration. He scrutinized the vellum deed, holding it up to the light. He made no comment, but rose from his desk and went to a tall cabinet, from which he pulled a series of large, rolled county maps and heavy, leather-bound parish ledgers. For more than an hour, there was no sound in the office but the rustle of old paper and the scratch of his pen as he made notes. Lucy sat in silence, her hands clenched in her lap, her entire future held in the balance of this quiet man's judgment. Finally, Mr. Davies looked up, peering at her over the top of his spectacles. A slow, small smile touched his lips. "It is all in order, Miss Ashford," he said, his voice calm, but with a new and unmistakable note of respect. "The survey maps from 1780 confirm the boundaries. The parish records note the closure of the main house due to the Great Fever. According to the law, the property has lain dormant, but the title was never extinguished. Stonefall Manor is legally and indisputably yours. It has been waiting for you." The news spread through Hartwick not like a wildfire, but like a slow-rising tide. Tom Fletcher told the blacksmith, who told the publican, who told everyone else. The story of the hidden deeds, confirmed by the solicitor, became village legend overnight. Mr. Thorne was seen leaving the public house early, his face ashen, speaking to no one. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a stunned, curious respect. As Lucy walked back through the village that evening, people no longer looked away. They nodded. Some even smiled. An old woman, Mrs. Gable, whose grandmother had been a laundry maid, stopped her and pressed a small pot of homemade jam into her hands. "My gran used to talk about the old house," she whispered, her eyes shining with remembered wonder. "She said the gardens were the finest in the county, said you could get lost in the rose maze for a whole afternoon." The chorus of the village was changing its tune, and the whispers were no longer of a fool and her ruin, but of a lost history, and the quiet, determined girl who had brought it back into the light. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the valley, Lucy did not stop at the cottage. She continued up the overgrown lane, past the clearing where her small home stood as a steadfast guardian. The lane narrowed further, becoming a mere track between ancient, gnarled oak trees that formed a canopy overhead. And then she saw them, two massive stone gateposts, taller than a man on horseback, almost completely swallowed by a century's growth of ivy. Between them hung a pair of immense iron gates, their black paint peeled away to reveal a filigree of deep orange rust. A heavy chain and a padlock, the size of a man's fist, held them shut. This was the true entrance. From the tin box, she had taken a single, enormous iron key. It felt heavy and cold in her hand, a solid piece of the past. She fitted it into the lock. It resisted, stiff with age and disuse. She put her whole body into it, turning with all her strength. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to rise from the earth itself, the mechanism turned. The chain fell away with a clang that echoed in the quiet air. Putting her shoulder to the gate, she pushed. It moved reluctantly, scraping a deep arc in the damp soil, opening for the first time in 100 years. Before her, a long, straight drive, lined with majestic lime trees, stretched into the distance. And at its end, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, stood Stonefall Manor. It was not a ruin. It was a house in a deep, enchanted sleep. The gray stone walls were solid and true, the windows dark and reflective, as pools of still water. A roof of heavy, moss-softened slate had held firm against a century of storms. It was vast, silent, and possessed a severe, melancholy beauty. Pip sat beside her, his body pressed against her leg, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the ground. Lucy stood on the threshold of her inheritance, looking at the sleeping house and the vast, quiet lands that stretched away to the moors. She felt no flush of triumph, no surge of pride. Instead, a profound sense of peace settled over her, quiet and deep as a well. She murmured the words to herself, a whisper, for no one but the wind and the stones. It was never about finding a house. It was about finding a home. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet strength and the power of looking closer at what the world has dismissed. If you were moved by Lucy's discovery and her journey of restoration, please leave a like and a comment below, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of the treasures we forget. Our next story is about a clockmaker who inherits a watch from his estranged father that doesn't tell time, but something far more valuable.